Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to round 3 coverage of my games from the 2018 Western States Open held in Reno, Nevada. In round 3 was held Saturday morning at 10 a.m. And I made sure this morning to get myself a cup of coffee before the game. I was a little bit foggy in my my first game on Friday, and I didn't want to repeat that. Overall, I was feeling pretty good though. I had a loss and a win so far, and the win does a lot to restore your confidence. My opponent in round 3 here was rated 1823, and my rating for the tournament was 1861. And White here had a very interesting style. We'll get to it pretty quickly. So he started off with e4. I went c5, the Sicilian defense. He goes knight f3, go d6, and he goes bishop to b5 check. So I call this the Canal-Sokolsky attack. That's the name I've been using on this channel. Although I think it's more commonly referred to as the Moscow attack or the Moscow variation. There's also a Moscow variation in the Semi-Slav and probably others as well. But I call it the Canal-Sokolsky just because that was the first name I saw. It was the first. Both names are given in the ECO, the Encyclopedia of Chess Openings, and the Canal-Sokolsky attack was the first name in the list. So I've been calling it that. But other people call it the Moscow variation. I think that's the more common name. Anyway, names aside, this presents black with a choice. There's basically only 3 moves to consider. The king can't move. You don't want to block with the queen. So your choices are bishop d7, knight c6, or knight d7. They each have a slightly different character. Bishop d7 that I played is the most common. And it leads to a fairly even position. I think all of these lines lead to pretty much an even position, but with interesting play for White. With knight to c6, you're giving White the option of trading off and damaging your pawn structure. So knight d7 is a way to kind of keep as many pieces on the board as possible and go for a long game. But bishop d7, directly challenging that bishop there, is kind of a logical move and the most common. And then here White usually takes rather than retreat. And here you should take back with the queen. I mean, it's possible to take back with the knight, but in this case the knight has a really good square on c6 without the bishop. The light squared bishop is gone from the board now, so there's no pin anymore. So you want to take back with the queen so you have knight c6 later. And now here White played an interesting move, c4. I may have seen this in a blitz game, but I haven't actually seen this over the board. I looked it up later and I discovered it's one of the 2 main moves here. The move I've seen, or the way it's been played in my experience, is that White castles, I play knight c6, and White plays c3 with the idea of building up a strong center with the later d4. And that leads to an interesting game as well. But c4 is the other main move. Those 2 moves are actually, those 2 lines are equally popular. And White is just going for a Maroczy bind kind of setup. So let's continue. I go knight c6. It's pretty logical to put a knight here looking at this hole on d4 that White has created. White plays knight c3. Go knight f6, get the other knight out. White castles, and I go g6. It is possible, instead of knight f6 and g6, to play with e6. That is a way of playing. But the d-file will probably open up later, and this d-pawn might be weak. So I wasn't so sure about this. Also, after c5, after White played c4, I didn't have any specific opening knowledge. So I didn't want to take on any unnecessary weaknesses. I was just doing all these calculations by myself over the board, and just played what looked like the soundest setup. And this turns out to be the main way of playing. e6 is slightly less popular than knight f6, castles, and g6. So anyway, White here does continue with d4. I take. I didn't want White gaining any more space there. And after I played bishop g7, this is Maroczy bind against a Sicilian dragon type of setup. And he continued with a very interesting move, bishop to e3. Before we get to that, that's a rare move in this case. So this is where White's originality is starting to show. The main move is knight d to e2. That knight is in a bit of trouble. because there are potential discovered attacks on that knight. It's defended once and attacked once, but this bishop can attack it. There can be a discovered attack from the bishop there. So then black castles and white plays f3, and this is just continuing on in a normal Maroczy bind kind of fashion. It's interesting that white has gotten rid of the light squared bishop, which with all these pawns on light squares, that's the bad bishop. So it might seem like this is an advantageous version of the Maroczy bind, but really black is just fine here. The exchange has helped black as well because black has a little less space, and whenever there's a minor piece exchange, it helps the side with less space. And there's good squares for the remaining pieces. This rook can come to the c file. This knight can hop into e5 there, and this bishop has potential along this diagonal. So anyway, it's about an even position. So just getting rid of the light squared bishop here is something that really improves white's position a whole lot. But anyway, that is not what that is not what white played here. So that would have been knight to e2. What he played instead was bishop to e3. And now there's a very natural response from black, which is the best move here. So if you want to take a second and see if you understand what move I'm talking about, this would be a good little quiz for you. Okay, the most natural move here is knight to g4. He hasn't done anything about controlling this square. My queen defends the knight there. He hasn't played f3 or h3. Sometimes h3 is played too to keep control of that g4 square before developing the bishop to e3. But now he just put the bishop out there, allowing this nice piece to be exchanged off. But white gets something in exchange. So this was, he thought for a long time, my opponent did, before playing this move. So he didn't just play that on a whim or casually. He was calculating this out and chose this line deliberately. Now, objectively, black should be okay here, but white does get some interesting play. So he didn't move the bishop. He took here first. And now if I just take back, he has a chance to save his bishop. So I don't want that. I want to grab the bishop and force him to double his pawns. I had to also calculate this out, make sure that there weren't any great discovered attacks that this knight can make, or any great desperado moves, but it doesn't have anything that's special. So white should take back, and he does. And then I should take the knight. The question is, should I take with the queen or the pawn? There's arguments in favor of both moves. If I take with the pawn, it keeps his knight from coming into this d5 square, which is a nice square for the knight. But I also notice that if I take with the queen, I'm already taking advantage of his loose pawns here. The chess engine actually slightly prefers taking with the pawn. In the game I played taking with the queen. I think I underestimated how strong this knight d5 move is. And in fact, I ended up not taking this pawn. There is a problem here if you want to do a little bit of tactics quiz. So knight d5 shields this pawn and introduces a tactic that indirectly defends that pawn. Okay, yeah, pause the video if you want to think about the tactic. I'm going to give the answer away. If I were to take that pawn now, he can play rook c1, chase my queen away. Well, I can grab another pawn here, actually, but then he gets this check. And white's a little better here with wins the exchange, and I am down a couple of pawns. And actually, I'm going to have to waste. I mean, he's down a couple of pawns, but he's up the exchange, and I'm going to have to waste a couple of moves to round up the knight. I have to make sure the knight doesn't get out of there alive. So white is better, but not by a huge amount. It actually may even be playable, but not what I was looking for. Also, if I just play normal moves, I probably am slightly better here, even after this queen move and knight d5. Just have to find the right move. Now the chess engine would take the other pawn, boldly taking that pawn, allowing rook b1, and then dropping the bishop back to e5, which is the move I played. I played bishop e5. I wasn't sure if I really wanted to go grabbing that pawn right away and giving white even more play. So I kept it simple. and just played bishop e5 directly. And my idea was that I figured white was going to come out and threaten my f pawn, and I was planning to block that with f6. And I didn't want the bishop to be stuck back here on g7 when I played f6. So I noticed that there was this good square on e5, blockading those pawns. The bishop can't be chased away by pawns now because those pawns are doubled. So I'm taking advantage of white's messed up pawn structure. And then I felt like I was pretty solid over here on the king side. So anyway, after I played f6 to blunt the diagonal, white brought his queen over to h3, looking at the h-file invasion here. So I first played queen d7. I wanted to bring the queen back. Notice, by the way, that I can't castle here. You might think, why not castle? There's also a problem on the previous move here, and of course the problem is that. So that knight on d5 is quite an annoying piece. It really is limiting the kinds of moves I had, which is why I went for this somewhat peculiar setup with f6. So this queen d7 move is doing two things. One is it's offering the trade of queens, but it's also coming back and defending the e-pawn so that I can castle. So white drops the queen into h6 right away. This prevents me from castling on the king side, but I went ahead and castled on the queen side. I think I'm fairly safe over here. Well, black continued to play enterprisingly with c5. The chess engine says that black should play rook to b1, defend this pawn, and then maybe this pawn can come forward to hold on to the c pawn if necessary, and then there's no problem with the bishop on the diagonal. The rook is out of the corner, so that would be a reasonable way for white to play, and black is probably still a little bit better. After this move, c5, actually black should have a winning edge. This is like one pawn sack too many, but it is opening up some lines, so I have to be careful. Here was his idea. I take, and then he plays the rook to d1. And so this comes with a tactic. The knight is threatening to come here to b6 with a check and opening up this attack on my queen. So I met this tactic by just playing king to b8. And then white brought his queen into g7. And this is an interesting position. Now the queen and the knight are ganging up on the e-pawn here. And if I move my rook away, then these pawns over here become weak. If I move this rook away, though, then there may be problems on this file. So I ended up moving the other rook and just giving up a pawn over here. I'm a pawn up, and if he gets a pawn back, I still have these structural advantages. So this actually is a decent move. And the idea is that if the knight moves now, I can actually exchange the queen for two rooks on the back rank. And I think that's a decent position for me. So I was willing to go for that. And in fact, that's what happens here. He provokes that situation by playing knight to f4. And I take. Let's see here. I did not actually have to take. The chess engine thinks that this move is fine. I considered this. And I was wondering if my bishop would actually just get locked in. He can push, taking advantage of the pin. I can take with the pawn, and he can drop a knight in here. He's got some good squares. He's given up two pawns, but and my bishop looks like kind of a silly piece here, blocked in behind the pawns. But I am material up, and I guess in the long run the bishop is not going to be staying locked up. I can push this pawn forward, and the bishop can escape. So that would have been an okay way to play. It just wasn't very appealing to me somehow to put my bishop in front of the queen and block it in with pawns. But it seems to be okay. Another move, which I did not think about, but also seems to be all right, is just to drop the queen back to c8 and allow a trade like this. If he takes here, I guess I can take with the queen. One point is that I'm actually worried a little bit too much about this e-pawn. I think I'll come back to this point, though. Let's So anyway, I went ahead and took. I thought for a long time before this move as well, because it's now a unbalanced situation. I think I'm better with the two rooks and the bishop against the queen and the knight, but the queen and the knight can coordinate very well, and I have to be careful that they don't get active around my king. And so the key is whether my pieces can coordinate. If the two rooks, you know, stay connected or close enough to each other that they can connect at any time, then they can be a very powerful force as the board opens up, especially. Anyway, after this exchange, white's in check, went king f2. And I was really worried now about this move, queen to f7, hitting by rook, chasing it away and grabbing the e-pawn. And that's why I was saying I was worried too much about that e-pawn. At this point, I should really just forget about it. But anyway, the idea I had here was king c8, and that's the move I played, so that if he attacked my rook, I could defend it. That turned out to be a kind of a mistaken idea. We'll show that in a bit. So what could I have played instead of king c8? This is the best line, I guess. Here's a check. I knew I had this check, of course, and picking up the pawn. This pawn has been hanging for quite a while, and I've just been waiting for the right time to pick it up, and this would be a good time. If he goes king e1, this is what I was a little bit worried about, kind of chasing my rook away so that the queen could come in here and attack my rook. This is the point. I should just abandon that e-pawn, play rook to c8. And after the queen takes that pawn, you know, my bishop is solidly holding on to the f-pawn here, so I still have decent control over the center against these doubled pawns. So I no longer need that e-pawn. I mean, I wanted to hold on to it to keep his pieces from flooding in towards my king, but my attack is really quicker here. It's my turn to move, and I can just start to threaten to queen that pawn. And so that would be a pretty simple win, actually. Did not calculate that one correctly at all. Let's see. The other way white could play after rook d2 check is to bring the king up to f3, and that's in fact best play according to the chess engine, after which it says I should trade this knight. So the other thing I was reluctant to do is to trade off that bishop for that knight and straighten out his pawns, because now it's just purely two rooks against the queen, and it's easy to get into trouble with just two rooks against the queen in my experience. But I have a quick pawn coming forward with c4, and what says white should play e5. Once again, queen f7 would be met with rook to c8, so queen f7 is nothing to worry about. And but anyway, it says that this position is winning for black. You know, my pawns are breaking through first, and my rooks are well enough coordinated to hold off the queen. Of course, I would still have to be very careful, watching out for any forks the rest of the game. Anyway, so this move, king c8, was a mistake. White went ahead and played queen takes h7, went to g5 to kick the knight, and then white went with queen f7 check, throwing in an intermediate move. But right here, I just wanted to show the idea why my plan wasn't so great. If white were to play queen f7 here, attacking my rook, my plan was to play king to d7. And white just has a good move here. You always got to watch out for these tactics. Can you spot the move that white should play right here? Okay, pause the video if you want time to think about it. I'm going to give the answer away. Yeah, white has the move queen to b7. So if I had played this way, I have to defend the rook and or move the rook, and when I do that, white can grab this pawn here. And this kind of turns the game around. It's white is doing better after that. The queen has gotten active, and and my king is running for shelter. So it's a difficult position. My rook probably has to come back here someplace where it's defended. My king can't escape here because the knight is covering that square. You know, it's just a bad position for me. So after queen f7, let's see, my best move here is actually once again to give up that e-pawn, just play rook to d8, and then let's see, the knight can hop into e6 and chase my rook around, and then the queen can grab the pawn, and I can play a check here, and well, there's another check here with this pawn, Yeah, this is an interesting idea. I can play this check and grab the g-pawn and coordinate my rooks this way. And seems like I'm okay, but it's still an even game at this point. I've given up my advantage. So anyway, that's best play from both sides. So he went with queen f5 check, chased my king back to the corner, but this actually is helping me a little bit. Now he saves his knight with knight to e6, and I do finally go for the rook d2 check and grabbing the pawn. Let's see, he went king f3, and well, I played b6 first. I didn't want his knight coming over and taking the c pawn and getting active around my king. Let's see, he played queen g6, hitting my rook. I went rook to c8 now. I was starting finally to realize that maybe that wasn't so important in any way. I need to get my rook over here behind the c pawn. Let's see, he went queen g7 here, setting up an interesting little tactic. Notice that right here, white is actually threatening to take the g pawn, because if I take back, then he can snag my bishop. So I didn't want to allow that. I didn't want to just give up this pawn because, you know, this is a useful pawn in holding back these two pawns. As we get into an endgame, I have to worry about situations where all the pieces get traded off and it turns into a pawn race. So I don't want to give him, you know, a straight line, an open file all the way down. I want to have at least one piece there, one pawn there to try and slow down his pawns. So I dropped my bishop back to d6. He went with e5 now, though, so I am going to end up losing that g-pawn anyway. I guess there was no way around this, but I found kind of a clever way to ditch the pawn. I played g4 check. If I had just taken here, you know, then once again he can take this pawn. So either way I take, he can take that pawn. So I throw the pawn away this way. This sets a little trap. If he takes with the king, of course I have rook to g2 check with the skewer and picking up the queen. So he has to take with the queen. And now there's no longer this tactic. The queen is no longer on g7, so I can just take this pawn with no trouble. But it is a trade. I gave up the g-pawn for the his doubled e-pawn. So a slight improvement for white here. Let's see, white plays queen a4, trying to stay active with the queen and park it around my king side. But already here, c4 is a winning move. I wasn't quite sure yet, so I was not going to push that pawn until I was sure. Let's see. So I dropped my rook back, harassing his knight, just chasing it away from my king. I just didn't want his queen and his knight coordinating over here, and I wanted to control some of these squares. You know, his queen is looking to come into these squares, and I wanted to make sure I had those well under control before I started any more maneuvers with the pawn. So anyway, he dropped his knight back to f4, and now I finally grabbed that b-pawn. So this is looking pretty good. He went with e4 here. Actually, the best move, according to the chess engine, is queen to c4. He should now, you know, put a lot of effort into trying to slow these pawns down as much as possible. But white is still going for counterplay here with e4. And now I finally push c4. And this is just a winning procedure for me, although it's not game over yet. There's still some complications that come up. Let's see. He goes knight to d5. Push on with c3. And I don't worry about this pawn because I figure if he takes here, you know, I will trade my rook for a queen, and that should be fine. So I push on with c2, but this actually gets me into a bit of trouble. So what should I play here? Rook to c7 is a simple move. Get my rook out of away from that knight, and I still have this pawn coming through. I suppose I could even consider sacrificing the exchange here if he plays knight back to d5. But anyway, I didn't look at that too much. Now I just pushed on with c2, and I had seen that he could take here, and I thought his idea was queen takes. You know, it looks very threatening, but I realized, well, I can just take his knight if he plays that, and then there's no way of him stopping my pawn from queening. So I thought, well, let's see. I have to do this in the right order. If I were to queen, it's my move here, and then he takes here with his queen, then I take his knight, and I've got a queen, a rook, and a bishop against a queen, and as long as there's no perpetual check here, which I did not see any perpetual check, I thought I would be fine. But we got to this position, and I realized he had a different idea. He's actually threatening to take this rook. I hadn't noticed that before. So that would be just 2 rooks for the queen. I queen here, and we're back to an even game. So so I had to think fast here. So there's only one move here that really is winning for black, and you might want to pause the video here and see if you can find the winning move. Okay, I found this over the board. The move is rook to d3 check. And it's just a clever idea. I want to get the rook out of trouble, and at the same time I want to queen with check if possible. So he played king e2. I still don't want to queen right away, because after I queen he can grab the rook, and I guess I still get his knight, but I wanted to get something a little more straightforward. So I followed up with rook to d2 check. He takes the rook, and now I queen with check, and that's the point. The king has 2 squares to go to. He chose here, and then I grab the knight, and so the dust is settled. This, by the way, is move 39. So with these last 5 moves were played in the shadow of the time control, which may explain some of the inaccuracies there. Definitely, I did not calculate ahead far enough at certain points there, but at least I found the resource when I needed to. Anyway, so this is still winning for black. I'm a piece up, and white has a pawn for the piece, but it's not quite enough compensation. Let's see, he played h3. He wanted to stop my queen from coming out and giving the check. And I just dropped my bishop back to e5. So here we are. This is move 40, so we made the time control. I just wanted to put the bishop on a safe square and then take a break, go for a walk, clear my head, and then come back and see how to finish this off. So after bishop e5, he went king f3. I went queen e6. I'm just centralizing my queen and looking to come out either on the queen side or the king side. I'm also taking a look at this pawn over here, keeping his queen tied down. And the chess engine thinks white should keep the queens on at this point and just push forward with h4, try and get counterplay this way. But definitely black is still winning. He went queen b3. And this goes into an endgame, or offers to go into an endgame. So I had to calculate carefully to make sure that this endgame is still winning for black, but it is anyway. It's a good exercise though if you want to calculate that. Would you exchange queens here and go for that endgame, and would you be confident of winning? That's the question. Anyway, yeah, pause the video if you want time to think about it, because we're just going to go over that. So I decided it was winning. So I traded queens and played a4 immediately. You got to get these pawns going on this side of the board as quickly as possible, and that's what's going to make the difference here. His king is already in danger of being outside the square, because it's important to note my bishop is guarding the queening square, so he's got to get his king to a square like a2 here to stop my pawns from coming through. So he had to start bringing his king over this way. He didn't have time to get his counterplay going with these pawns. And that also gives me time to bring my king over to where I'm within the square of these pawns. So if he moves this pawn forward, then I go here and I'm in the square. Let's see, so what did he play here? He went king d3 first, and I kept coming over towards this side of the board. Hang on a second. No, I played b5 first. Yeah. So that was a good move. His king was threatening to come in here. So I pushed my pawns forward. Now I control all of these squares, and his king can't make any inroads. And then my king can wander over here and round up these pawns. At least that's what I was thinking. So he went h4 now, and I played king d7. I have to stay within the square of that pawn. Either that or queen first. So I was just making sure I was going to hold this side steady and just make sure I was keeping these pawns under control. He went with g4, and I went with king e6. He went king e3, back this way. And now actually, I didn't take advantage of this, but actually his king is already too far away to stop me from queening. So the simplest way to win here is just to push the a-pawn forward. And just to show this, you know, a simple calculation might say, oh, the king is well inside the square of the pawn, but or just inside, I guess. You can move here, but it's not good enough because my bishop is controlling the queening square. So his king can start running over. But it doesn't get there in time. My bishop controls this square, and my pawn controls this square, so he has to go back here if he wants to get any closer, and then I queen. So anyway, that would have been the simplest win here. But, well, what I played is winning too. It's interesting, I didn't notice that. It was already winning to push that pawn. And I found a different idea here. I went bishop g3. I wanted to unsettle these pawns over here so that my king could get in there and attack them. So that was intended to force that pawn forward. White tried to take advantage of that move by stepping in this way. And of course, if he can get in here, I might turn the game around. But I had foreseen this possibility and knew that I had this move, bishop f2 check, and the king has to go back. And so at this point, you know, after the king goes back, I can even grab one of those pawns with the bishop. So anyway, at this point, he decided to resign. So a fun game. Hope you guys enjoyed this, and stay tuned for my round 4 coverage. See you then. Bye.